This video will cover the Student Learning Objective, or SLO component of the new PPFT appraisal system. The SLO process itself is fairly straightforward and is something that most teachers do naturally. Let's meet our teacher, Mrs. Lopez, who has just returned to school to teach 5th grade for her 10th year, and watch how she completes the SLO process. As soon as Mrs. Lopez receives her course rosters, she has to determine which course is her largest based on the student enrollment. Mrs. Lopez has a couple of options for her individual SLO course number. Since she instructs the same number of total students in both math and science, Mrs. Lopez can select either 5021 or 5031 as her course number, which means that she will be able to include all 35 students on her SLO. She also selects math because it is a big focus on the campus improvement plan.
Times 6. And what is 8 times 6?
Next, she conducts a needs assessment, where she reviews all available data sources to determine her students' strengths and weaknesses. First, she analyzes the beginning of year benchmark test to find that number and operations is her highest need STAR reporting category. Only 48% of number and operations questions were answered correctly, compared to 56% of measurement, which is the next highest need. Out of the 4 operations, students scored 63% on addition and subtraction items, but only scored 41% on the multiplication and division problems. Additionally, over the last 5 years of 3rd through 5th grade, STAR data for the campus shows that the number and operations, especially multiplication and division, is consistently the lowest STAR reporting category. Based on the beginning of year and STAR results, Mrs. Lopez aligns her area of high need to the math TEKS where the student expectations 5.3a, b, and c are the focus of her SLO. All 3 student expectations cover multiplication, division, and estimation. Now Mrs. Lopez must rephrase the standards into a learning objective sentence that states, students will estimate to determine solutions to real-world math problems involving multiplication and division. Multiply 3-digit numbers by 2-digit numbers using the standard algorithm, and solve quotients with 4-digit dividend by a 2-digit divisor using strategies and the standard algorithm. The learning objective is what Mrs. Lopez hopes her students will learn by the end of the year. Once Mrs. Lopez has written her learning objective, she browses the AISD vetted and approved assessment bank on the SLO database, looking for an assessment that addresses her learning objective and standards. Mrs. Lopez finds an appropriate 5th grade test that assesses multiplication and division. The assessment has 25 multiple choice questions that are each worth 4 points for a total possible score of 100 points. After critically reviewing it, she selects this assessment and then administers it to all of her 5th grade math students.
Please remember to put your name and the date on it. You may turn it over and begin.
On a side note, if Mrs. Lopez chooses to create an assessment, she must meet the specific guidelines and be validated by her appraiser. So she must be sure to read the SLO assessment section of the PPFT appraisal support guide carefully. Now Mrs. Lopez must determine her student growth target. Growth targets are clear and specific targets for individual student growth that determine whether the students have successfully met their SLO. The growth target is the amount of growth required of students to meet their individual goals. Mrs. Lopez SLO will use what has been nicknamed the split the difference formula. When using this formula, in order to meet their goal, each student must improve by half of the points needed to get a perfect score. For example, on an assessment worth 100 total points, if a student scores a 40 on the pretest, she would have to improve by 30 points to meet her growth target, since 100 minus 40 is 60, and 60 divided by 2 is 30. With a 40 on the pretest and 30 more points of growth needed, she needs a score of at least a 70 on the post-test to meet her SLO growth target. After Mrs. Lopez scores her students' pre-assessments, she analyzes the results and enters the data onto an SLO spreadsheet that already has a growth target formula for a 100-point assessment. On the spreadsheet, Mrs. Lopez includes the student names, pre-test scores, growth targets, and any comments about each student's test administration. The growth target shows that her students must make half the growth required to score of 100. Once she administers, scores, and records the pre-assessment results, the next step is for Mrs. Lopez to enter her SLO into the online database. She checks to make sure that she completes all the required fields of the SLO, as well as upload the appropriate documentation attachments, including an SLO spreadsheet and a blank copy of the SLO assessment and the answer key. When Mrs. Lopez is done with her SLO database entry, she submits it so that her appraiser can validate the SLO or send it back for revisions. If she does receive a revision request, then she has 10 working days to make corrections and resubmit. It is now time for Mrs. Lopez to teach for the remaining months of the year.
For division, we were dividing 215 divided by 6. So we started off by using...
As she teaches, she thinks about techniques for spiraling the content of her learning objective into her math instruction throughout the year and adjusting lessons based on student progress. Ideally, this should be an ongoing conversation between her teammates and her administrator, which leads to dramatic improvement in the area identified in her learning objective. Since SLOs are designed to show growth over the full length of the course, Mrs. Lopez administers a post-assessment at the end of the year, which is the same exact test as the pre-assessment. After she scores her post-assessments and enters them into her SLO spreadsheet, along with each student's actual growth and whether each student met their goal, her final percentage of students who met the goal can be calculated. Mrs. Lopez's class has 4 out of 6 students meet their SLO growth target required, which equals 67%. The final percentage of students who meet the goal is used in calculating her SLO appraisal score. Mrs. Lopez's appraiser will validate her assessment results, which she will discuss at her summative conference.
So how do you think your students did in their SLO?
Well, overall, 89% of my students met goals, so I'm very pleased that we had a good number who met target. I was very happy about that.
This completes Mrs. Lopez's PPFT appraisal SLO process for this year.